Okay, let's
Yes.
go.
Let's
So,
go.
hi to everyone watching at home. We're here with Richard Ovenden, Bodley's librarian, and most recently, the author of Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack, which is available online and in stores from Blackwell's and next door from the Bodleian Library shop. So thank you, Richard, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us and delve into the book.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lena. I mean, it's wonderful to talk to the history of the book community here in Oxford. It's obviously a very, very important one for the Bodleian and for me personally, partly because what I've tried to do with the book is bring the history of the book to play a part in discussing very, very current concerns, not just for libraries and archives, but for the role that they play in society. So this book is partly a kind of book historical account of attacks on knowledge and in particular attacks on libraries and archives, but it's also a bit of kind of an attempt to enter into the arena of public policy. You know, what should we do now and into the future on behalf of society that libraries and archives can play this, what I think is an absolutely crucial role for democracy and for an open society more generally.
I think what I love about that is it's going to help students watching this who are taking history of the book think about why their work matters and how their work can actually have an impact in the world today. So it's not just, studying the Middle Ages, but it's what lessons can we take and how can we take them further.
Yeah.
So that actually gets to, I think, the real core of this interview, because I'm thinking about this as someone who's just finished an MST in modern languages, and I'm starting a DPhil in education this fall. And just to set the stage for people watching at home, we're filming this for the History of the Book blog, which is a resource run by and for students on the History of the Book course taught by Enriching, who's our technician today and raiser of the host, as we're calling her. So I'm hoping we can talk about the history of knowledge, as you said, and thinking about the place of students, teachers, pedagogy, and learning, all of that good stuff in that broader narrative. So just, to get to the point, why should History of the Book students read this book?
Well, I hope that they'll take something from each of the individual kind of case studies that I've selected, and people who read the book may find that there are kind of episodes that they expected to be in there that aren't. So, I don't discuss, the Timbuktu and the Malian episode more in the last 10 or 15 years around attacks on Islamic manuscripts, or Ireland, the Public Record Office of Ireland, because there are actually so many case studies I could have included in the book. So I've tried to give it a kind of a long arc, going back into the ancient world and the ancient, beginning with the first libraries and archives in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, right through to the present era and the digital world that we're all living in now. So I hope each of those case studies may be illuminating. And I think it's also important to remember that the history of the book is not purely about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It's what just happened. What happened yesterday is just as important for studying the history of the book. So I think there is this kind of long arc, but I think it's also about the book is really about the preservation of knowledge and about how important that is. And it's taking a view on the social importance, the social value of preserving knowledge, in particular investing in the institutions that society has kind of chosen to invest that in, libraries and archives, and looking at that social value by looking at the times in history when we've lost knowledge, when knowledge has been deliberately attacked, where it's been targeted, where it's been destroyed, and the impact that that's had on societies. And then to sort of mark and to celebrate and to raise above pure history, if you like, the acts of preservation through time, the individuals, the institutions that have stepped up to the plate to try and preserve knowledge.
Something I want to zoom in on that you just pointed out is this relationship between the diversity of narratives that we're telling and which episodes we choose to highlight, and the act of preservation itself. Do you think when it comes to the Bodleian, there are any sort of endangered or underrepresented books or collections that should be prioritized so we can prevent the same thing from happening?
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I hope that nothing in the library is endangered. I think that's the first thing to say. And the fact that they're in the Bodleian and the focus that we have as an institution on preservation, and not just on, if you like, the pure act of conservation, but the effort that we make in ensuring that we're free from fire, we have stable temperature and relative humidity controls, that we have a secure perimeter, that we regularly monitor the state of the collections, and that we do that for the digital collections as well as for the physical ones. I mean, I think these are the kind of core things that are the bread and butter of libraries and archives.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you rightly draw attention to is that particularly within vast collections like the Bodleians, there are always collections that have not been so well recorded, that they haven't had the benefit of active conservation activity as much as other collections, that the documentation around them, the cataloguing and metadata. For example, a few years ago, I think when was it, 2014-15, we did an exhibition on our Armenian manuscripts and printed books. Cool. Now, that was a collection that actually we first acquired our Armenian books in the early 17th century. And there'd been a very, very long time since they'd been kind of collectively studied, that we'd done an exhibition, that we'd done documentation, and supported publications on. That exhibition brought additional attention to the fact that we had the collection. It's brought more scholars to come and work on them. It's raised that whole cultural engagement that we've had with the Armenian community in the UK and in Armenia and through the rest of the world, much, much higher. So I think there are always collections like that which we constantly should be revisiting. We should be updating the metadata. For example, in the light of Black Lives Matter, have we actually faced our past honestly and openly, and reinterpreted the fact that we may have collections that were stolen through the activities of the British Empire, and that our catalogue records, our finding aids, need to reflect that truth. So I think there's a whole process of that, which is part of, if you like, the kind of very broader activities that you would have in preservation. I think one of the things that is most urgent to me are the collections that are outside libraries and archives that we need to be documenting, preserving, bringing into those curatorial environments, that we can ensure that they're available for scholarship or for the public to have access to. And I think that's in particular in the digital world, where and I think I draw attention to this in the book, where things like web archiving, social media, blogs, this whole broader cultural engagement which we have now in digital worlds, our lives are played out digitally. How do we capture that? How do we preserve it? And that's just the most obvious things. I think even bigger and more worrying for me is the digital information that we just don't see. It's all of the data that is captured every time we log on to a website, every time we click like on Twitter, every time that we make a transaction, every time we search on a search engine. That information about us is being stored and collected, and there are digital profiles on us which are made by commercial organizations and which are traded every day. So all of the free tools that we access online, they are not free. we are giving our labour for nothing to create them, which are creating resources which are then making the big tech companies, what our Oxford colleague Timothy Garton-Ash, the professor of European history, calls the private superpowers. We're making them richer every time we engage in that digital world. And I think that the great libraries and archives of the world should be trying to acquire that data and capture it, even if it's just sampling, because it's vast in its scope, so that we can understand what our society is like, what we are doing today into the future, because it's pretty scary, I think.
Scary is, I think, a very nice way of putting it, for sure. But what you're also pointing out is that this act of preservation, this very active thing you have to do, it's much more immediate now. We can't just wait 50 years and then think, what tweets do we want to archive? And Black Lives Matter is a great example. Like, how do you capture that in the moment? Something that is creating and generating so much data. And I think you've also foreshadowed my next question, which is we want to think about how do history of the book students fit into that act, and in very practical terms, we need to assign them projects quite soon. And I know it's not the time and place for concrete suggestions, but how should those students start thinking about making really good use of the Bodleian's holdings and, like you said, things that are outside of the library as well?
So I think I've got two sort of very broad suggestions. So in terms of engaging with the Bodleian's collections, or indeed other libraries and archives in Oxford, in the colleges and so on, is to talk to the curators, talk to the staff who have responsibility for them, come with your own ideas, do as much research ahead of time as you can, find collections that may not be quite so well known, or corners of them, or aspects perhaps of well-known collections that could be viewed with a new light, and have a dialogue with our staff, with my colleagues, about areas that you would like to invest your time or do more research on to illuminate the collections that we have. And that could be in terms of cataloging, enriching catalog descriptions or metadata, or revisiting them to put more accurate or more up-to-date information in place. It could be by just simply saying, well, within this broad collection, I don't know, from the top of my head, we have this amazing collection called Oppenheimer, which was the library of the Rabbi of Prague in the 17th century. It's regarded as one of the great collections of, European culture that we have in the library. It's absolutely astonishing thing. Joshua Teplitsky has just recently written a book about the Oppenheimer collection, which was published by Yale. But it's so big and it contains so much information that there are bound to be corners of that collection that Joshua Teplitsky didn't really have time in his study to examine fully. And there'll be many other collections crossing many other cultures and many other traditions of bookmaking that will be true for. So do the research, talk to our colleagues, and find something that would make a difference. On the other hand, on the stuff that might be outside of the library, we already have a book collecting prize. We already have an essay competition on the history of the book. So they're examples of where we can, there could be a very nice symbiosis here, where you could find a collection that you build yourself, maybe outside the library's current collecting regime, and that you could submit for the book collecting prize, or that you could write an essay and submit for the Duff Prize, and also either maintain yourself and make a pledge to gift it to the Bodleian in 20 years' time, when it's got even bigger and more interesting, or suggest that it's something which the Bodleian might want to take over. And that could be a collection of websites, it could be a collection of posters, it could be printed ephemera, There are all sorts of aspects where the act of curation and the act of preservation together could create a kind of new way of looking at the world. And and that's how great, the Bodleian is a collection of collections. And they start small. They start with somebody not just collecting one thing, but by bringing another thing together with it and making that connection, making a bridge between them. And then it kind of grows and expands out from that. So constantly think about those things and have a look at the world around you. Have a look at what is happening today, what is current, what is generating material. I was struck a few years ago. I was in Hong Kong at the time of the umbrella protests, and I walked through the student camp, and I found a staircase, concrete staircase, quite long, quite big, and it was just covered in post-it notes. And so the people who were walking past were encouraged to write a message. And I took a kind of, just I had my iPhone, so I took some shots and some video of the comments and the documents that were physically created by that community in that very, very special moment in time. And what are the equivalents for you today? What's happening in your neighborhood, or what's happening in your home country? What's happening in your world? What are students doing, communicating with each other about at the moment? So there are my two kind of quite broad suggestions.
I think we need to update the syllabus after this video call. Because I can imagine you doing like a capsule of 2020 that's multimedia as a book history project. And if I recall correctly, the Bodleian was asking people to save materials that came in the mail about the Brexit vote.
Absolutely.
As well. Yep. So I think that's really great example.
I've been collecting all the stuff that's come through my letterbox about COVID, and it's going. I'm going to be giving it to the John Johnson collection of printed ephemera, so yeah, I mean, even if it's just an archive of screenshots of websites or of social media engagement, I mean, I think these are the methods of communication now. And digital culture is material culture. It's not just something that exists purely on a screen. That human beings interact with it too, and it often has a kind of material aspect to it. And I'll give you just one tiny little anecdote which much amused me. So if you look at the entry for my book on amazon.co.uk, you'll find that there are user ratings. And I was looking at this over the weekend. It's impossible when you publish a book. It's impossible not to be curious about these things. So there are currently 7 ratings of my book, or at least there was on Saturday when I looked, and there 2 people have actually left comments, written comments, and they've not just given me kind of marks out of 5 or whatever the scoring is. And one of them has marked me as a 2-star instead of a 5-star. And I was kind of thought, what are people saying about it? And he gave it 2-star because the book that arrived in the post, so the physical copy of the book, was damaged. And so he gave it 2 stars because it came with a damaged cover from Amazon.
What?
So that's why he gave it 2 stars, because he was commenting on the physical product, not on the intellectual content of the book. So books are material culture, and that's left its kind of its trace in the user ratings of my book on Amazon.
Well, we're going to have to go and leave some positive reviews just to say our books came in perfect condition. I'd like to think about someone who was, you know, the epitome of a collector and who was trying to capture his time, which is John Leland, and whom I read about for the first time in your book.
Mm.
And for folks watching at home, he was the antiquarius to Henry VIII on the eve of the Reformation, and the king asked him to travel the length and breadth of England, gathering materials from monasteries and colleges to bolster what you called the great matter, which is, you know, how do you divorce Catherine of Aragon? And thanks to Leland, we have a really rich source on what was in these medieval libraries before they were destroyed or dispersed. And what I think really struck me about that story is that his work as an antiquarian put him at the crossroads of scholarship, political crisis, and the preservation of knowledge. And those are three areas, you know, we've talked about and which are important to this day. So I want to ask you, what do you think the modern day antiquarian needs to know how to do? What skills do the Lelands of today need to have?
Ooh, well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think a sort of curiosity, you know, absolute sort of passion for research, for looking at evidence. And Leland had was very well educated. He had an educational background, not just in Oxford and Cambridge, but also at the University of Paris. So you know, he was taught by, you know, the by humanist scholars to interrogate primary sources. So I think that that approach is absolutely fundamental, that curiosity and that desire to go back to source material. I think the other thing that marked Leland out for me, and you know, we're lucky in the Bodleians we have his archive, so you know, go and call it up and look for yourself, is that he was absolutely passionate about what he was doing. I mean, he just absolutely threw his entire heart and soul into it. And one of the passages that most exemplifies this, I quote in my book, where he goes to Glastonbury Abbey. Yeah. And he's been dying to go there for ages to look at the books. And when he gets there, he goes into the library and he recounts this, and we have it in his own language, that he was awestruck. He got into the library and he swooned at the sight of the books. You know, he just, oh, God, they're so wonderful. I just, you know, he staggered. He had to compose himself. So that sort of passion stuff is something that's really important. And then I think the sort of the writing it up, you know, what we have in the Bodleian in Leland's archive are his notes, so we can see the list of books that Leland saw in Glastonbury on that visit where he swooned at the threshold, and so that process of documentation, of creating lists and then writing it up in bigger accounts, you know, bringing that individual scholarship to bear on broader narrative studies is what Leland did. And I think in today's terms, I think we should avoid the sense of thinking about just, you know, one collection type. I think we have to be much broader now. And of course, we have the primary sources in the physical form, but we also have primary sources in digital form, and then we have digital surrogates. So I think there's an important aspect to this, which is about being able to, you know, we're lucky that we live in a world where there are digitized copies of primary sources that we have, and of course in the COVID environment that means that we can still have access to collections around the world. So I think there's that sort of broad scope that we have to bear in mind, and I think that we should avoid doing what Leland did, which is go mad. Because he did eventually go insane, and I think that was part. I mean, obviously, we don't know why he went insane. You know, he may have had a genetic disposition to it. He may have been drinking himself to oblivion, for all we know. The interpretation I put it on it in the book is that he played a part through his both collecting and his, his research activity on behalf of Henry VIII and he was doing that in 1533, 1534. And then, of course, the dissolution of the monasteries and the other religious houses followed, which created the breakup of those great libraries, including Glastonbury. And I think that realizing that he played a part in its destruction may have, I think, perhaps it triggered his insanity.
Many thanks to both of you. I think we could easily continue that.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of Lena's own project for the history of the book, which was gathering together digitally a lost spread of editions of an early European book, Comenius, Latin educational book. I'm taking the technician's privilege of telling two anecdotes before saying the final. Thank you. Triggered by what Richard just said about his two-star review. Something similar happened to me. I contributed a chapter to this exciting venture, reading books as cultural objects, which was a conference 5 years ago. And it had been outsourced to China for printing. I was the first one to receive a copy, and when I opened it, it said legal aid in the Nordic countries. The publisher had given the same ISBN number to two books, and they were cross-bound. So, and I thought it was a really nice reflection on reading books as cultural objects. The publisher then wanted to all copies to be sent back to avoid embarrassment, but I kept hold of this as an example for
perfect.
Yeah. The most serious one is that I was really moved when reading again your opening example, because my grandmother did her PhD in the early 1930s, and she had been told by her doctoral supervisor to go into the archives to look at material that hadn't been published to make medieval German literature more accessible. And he protected her when she was excluded from the studentship as being qualified as a quarter Jew, so not fit for studying. But what I only learned 2 years ago is that the same doctoral supervisor, Wolfgang Stammler, had a part in advising the student body at Greifswald which books to burn. And so he was one of these ambiguous figures, as I think we see a lot in the history of the book, or history of humanity, who could very much see the value of one sort of learning, but he didn't think fit for preservation 19th century Jewish publications, or well, his bias was more towards communist writing, which he didn't want to see preserved. So it's a complex situation to deal with, and we are biased in our own time. So I really like your call to action, Richard, in spreading the load of watching out for what to preserve across different communities, so that we make sure we don't just preserve what our personal favorite is.
Yeah.
Amen.
So with that, many thanks to both of you, and I'll stop the recording now, and I'm sure we'll continue the conversation over the course of the coming months and years.
I hope so. Thank you very much. And, I hope all the students on the History of the Book course are going to have a terrific year. It will be an interesting one for all sorts of reasons, but I'm sure it will be an intellectually very, very stimulating one indeed. And look forward to meeting you either online or in person over the next 12 months.
Thank you.
Thanks again.